Traveling in Italy is a real treat for great book students. They open a great world of history to you. And though they're not an easy read, once you've read them, there's a whole world of history that you are ready to be familiar with.
This is a guide for those of you who are going to be traveling on your own. I hope that you'll look at the schedule that I put forward and realize that there is a lot of scheduling elements in it that make your trip travel more easily. And so use this as a guide if you're planning to go on your own, as a good way of seeing the main sites that are of interest to great book students. Also, I hope you see in this video just a general encouragement to all of you to travel. Travel is a wonderful opportunity, and I hope that by watching these videos, you'll be able to see just how much there is for you to be able to gain in doing so. And also, for those of you who may never be traveling, I hope that you'll watch this video as a learning tool to gain so many of the insights that you can by actually going to these sites. Now, when we go, we usually will leave on Thursday and travel through the night and arrive on Friday. When you first arrive, I'd highly recommend the first day that you start walking right away. This will help your body to become acclimatized to the time change and be able to get a good night's sleep that first night. Walking is a great way to get yourself ready for the next day.
Nero built a huge palace on the site where the Colosseum is, in a moment of self-aggrandizement. However, the later Emperor Vespasian was disgusted with Nero's self-luxury and got rid of the entire complex to build a sports arena to please the people.
The emperors did have absolute power. However, that power was only held so long as they could keep the people happy with bread and circuses. The Colosseum was built around AD 72 to 80. It was finished by Vespasian's son Titus. Curiously, many of those who worked on building the Colosseum were Jewish slaves who came to Rome after the fall of Jerusalem. If you look at the 4 stories of the Colosseum, you have a great opportunity to become familiar with what's called the Greek orders. The first is the Doric, the second is the Ionic, and the third is the Corinthian. Each of these type of orders can be seen in the types of pillars that are displayed on the side of the Colosseum. The Colosseum held 70,000 spectators, and these spectators were kept in comfort as they watched in the shade. If you look up at the top of the Colosseum, you will see places where poles were inserted so that a very large shade could actually cover the entire Colosseum. It actually took 1,000 sailors to hoist this great cover. The floor of the Colosseum is gone, but that allows you to see the lower workings that house the various animals and gladiators that would be brought up during the shows. Recently, they rebuilt one section of the floor so you can see what it was originally like. The structure is very well organized with quick access to all the sections. However, you will notice the steps are very steep. Games were held at the Colosseum until 523 AD, when they were stopped under the reign of the barbarian Ostrogoth Theodoric. During the Middle Ages, the Colosseum lay abandoned and many stones were removed to build the surrounding houses. The Arch of Constantine was built in celebration of his victory over his co-emperor Maxentius at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in AD 312. Constantine is said to have been victorious over Maxentius because he converted to Christianity and had the sign of the cross displayed on his shield during battle. Being the first Christian emperor, Constantine desired a broad unity on Christian doctrine, and so he called a council of the Christian bishops in the year 325 AD. At the Nicene Council, the Nicene Creed was formulated, and many Christians still recite it as a summary of the Christian faith. It begins, "We believe in one God, the Father, the Almighty, maker of heaven and earth." When we read Anselm's Cur Deus Homo, you'll find many of his positions on what Christians believe to be drawn right from the Nicene Creed. Even though Constantine established Christianity as the religion of the Roman Empire, the growing strength and power of the eastern portion of the empire is easy to see, as most of the statues in this arch are poorly recycled from other monuments. The eastern portion of the empire was so much more wealthy than the West that Constantine moved the capital from Italy to the more luxuriant and powerful East.
Though this was originally a political division, gradually it turned into a spiritual division as well between the Westerners who saw the Pope of Rome as their head and the Easterners who saw the Patriarch of Constantinople as their head. Gradually the tensions grew, and in around the year 1000 AD, the Pope and the Patriarch mutually excommunicated one another, and you have the division between the Roman Catholics and the Orthodox.
Eastern Europe followed the Patriarch, and Western Europe followed the Pope, and thus created the division between Roman Catholics and the Eastern Orthodox. It is often easy to think of biblical and classical history as disconnected. However, the Arch of Titus shows how close they are, and one of the points at which they come into direct contact with one another. This arch is well preserved and celebrates the victory of the Romans over the Jews in 71 AD and the destruction of Jerusalem. Particularly interesting is the relief showing the Romans in a triumphal march, bringing back silver trumpets and a 7-branched candlestick from Jerusalem. This arch gives you a good opportunity to reflect upon the triumphal processions of the various emperors through Roman history, and how Thomas Aquinas uses a very similar idea to help us understand God. The arch that you see here was actually used to host a triumphal procession. When a Roman general was tremendously successful, he would be given a triumph in Rome. He would come back to Rome with the loot and slaves and his mighty men, and he would parade them through Rome. And at the end of the parade would come the emperor himself. You having seen his greatness, now you can see the emperor himself and know just what a great man he is. Thomas Aquinas speaks of the processions of God. And the best way to think of this is that God himself has given us the entire world as his triumphal procession. The beauty of the sky, the wonder of the mountains, the majesty of the sea, all of these things are in a sense God showing us bits of himself. And so that when he reveals himself in his greatness, we as his people will receive him and adore him for the great God that he is. The Basilica of Maxentius was begun by Maxentius, but finished by Constantine after his victory over Maxentius at the Milvian Bridge. Though most of the building has crumbled, you can still get a very good idea of just how large it was, as the remaining portion is less than 1/3 of the original expanse. Basilica is an interesting word. It originally meant courthouse, but the term was later used for a church, as the form of church was very similar in shape to the courthouses of ancient Rome. The most obvious similarity is to the Basilica of St. Peter's. Think of the many events in Roman history that transpired in the narrow borders of the Roman Forum. This was the main area where Roman life was organized and directed from 509 BC to the demise of the Roman Empire in 476 AD. For better or worse, 985 years of national life were played out right here in this forum. Just think of how many of the great books' readings were describing events that happened here. The Greek biographer and Delphic priest, Plutarch, wrote the lives of the noble Greeks and Romans. Among many others, he recounts the noble struggle of the Roman Cato the Younger against the imperial forces who desired to overthrow the order of the Roman Republic. He also retells the lives of Julius Caesar and Coriolanus, stories that Shakespeare found so intriguing that he adapted them to the stage. The historian Tacitus tells the disheartening story of the degradation of Roman character that transpired during the transition from republic to empire. The poet Virgil, inspired by the divine muse he found in the generous patronage of the Emperor Augustus, attempted to use his lovely words to paint a more favorable image of the character of Augustus and his imperial house. We have no record of the Roman philosopher Lucretius coming to the Forum area. However, it is unlikely that this proponent of early materialism did not come here as well. Near the Forum, you can also see the house of Emperor Augustus' wife, Livia, who Tacitus railed against as a source of so many of Rome's ills. Particularly remarkable are the well-preserved painted walls and mosaic floors that give you a vibrant sense for the Romans' love of beauty in nature and geometric form. The Curia Julia was rebuilt a number of times during Roman history, and finally in 1937. However, if you consider that the Roman Senate sat for nearly 500 years before having its powers degraded under the empire, it is easy to see why our own form of government owes such a debt to the tradition that developed in Rome.
Here, men were able to work out much of what it meant to have rule of law, and also why the separation of powers was so crucial to maintaining a free people. Christianity also had a huge part on the formation of our government. However, the debt of gratitude that our own founding fathers owed to the Romans for establishing much of political wisdom should also be acknowledged.
Originally built in 497 BC, the Temple of Saturn was often rebuilt, and the remains you see here are from the rebuilding in 42 BC. Every year there is a week of feasting in honor of Saturn during December called the Saturnalia. During this time, slaves and masters often exchanged positions, gifts were exchanged, and prisoners were not allowed to be punished. Built in AD 113 by Emperor Trajan to celebrate his victory over the Dacians, Trajan's column is 131 feet high and covered with ornate carving showing his various campaigns. The story is told that when examining this column and seeing a picture of Trajan helping a woman whose son had been killed, Pope Gregory the Great was so moved to compassion for Trajan that he prayed God to release this pagan from hell, and God brought him to heaven. Though of quite dubious theology, this story is the explanation for the poet Dante seeing the Roman Emperor Trajan in heaven at the end of the Divine Comedy. The original St. Peter's Basilica was built in 326 by the Emperor Constantine upon his conversion to Christianity. However, at the beginning of the 16th century, the Roman Catholic Church decided to build a more magnificent headquarters. Construction started in 1450 and continued until 1780 when the final additions were completed. This monumental church building project not only created one of the most memorable buildings in church history, but through its construction, the church suffered not only a monumental financial cost, but spiritual one as well.
When a Roman Catholic priest was asked what was the cost of building St. Peter's, he simply replied, the Protestant Reformation. Though the Holy Spirit was obviously at work in the Protestant Reformation to bring the church back to a more pure understanding of Christ's work on the cross, one of the main reasons that Martin Luther separated from the Roman Catholic Church was that the Roman Catholics were selling indulgences to his fellow Germans to build this church. Indulgences were a particularly clever method that the church came up with to raise funds to cover the huge expenses that St. Peter's involved.
The concept of indulgences was simple. You simply give money to the church and they will forgive the sins of you or your loved one that might keep them from getting into heaven. This sales campaign did get the money flowing into the Roman treasury, but so offended the Northern Europeans that they separated themselves from the Catholics forever. Beautiful building, but most Catholics would probably think twice about the final cost. However, many great buildings have their storied past. Even the Pantheon in Athens has a dark financial underbelly. So let's forget the dark history and continue to enjoy what truly amazing beauty human ingenuity combined with centuries of hard work can produce. The construction of St. Peter's was supervised by a host of architectural greats. Raphael, Michelangelo, and Bernini among others. Indeed, the mastery of their artistic vision is evident all around you. St. Peter's Square is in fact an ellipse. However, the most interesting element is the obelisk displayed in the center of the square itself. This 83-foot obelisk was originally erected around 2500 BC in Heliopolis, Egypt. The Emperor Augustus had this obelisk removed from Heliopolis and taken down the Nile to Alexandria. It was then moved across the Mediterranean to Rome by the Emperor Caligula in AD 37. It stood near the Circus of Nero until 1586, when the Roman Catholics decided to move it a few hundred yards to its new location at the center of the Vatican Square.
The movement of this obelisk was a tremendous engineering feat. However, the moderns came to consider that it showed they had come to rival the engineering prowess of the ancients. What they did do was in fact quite impressive, but the moderns came to think that moving this obelisk was in fact a sign that they had come to rival the engineering prowess of the ancients. However, they then remembered that the ancients had moved it across the entire Mediterranean while they had only moved it across town. So much for rivaling the engineering prowess of the ancients.
It is still a lovely irony of history to have an Egyptian obelisk the Romans stole, now decorating the courtyard of a Christian church. It is hard not to feel that the present is nothing but a wisp of time, and all that matters is history. The facade of St. Peter's is quite imposing, and was actually one of the last elements of the church to be completed. Upon stepping into the church, Roman theology immediately confronts one. On the floor, one is presented with marble keys that remind the visitor of the Roman Catholic doctrine of papal authority.
The Roman Catholics believe that the Apostle Peter came to Rome and founded the Roman Catholic Church. And that because in Matthew 16, 17 through 20, Jesus says to Peter, "On this rock will I found my church," that the Roman Catholic Church has the authority to rule over all other churches of the world.
The interior of the church is quite breathtaking. The scale is so vast that one's own human significance seems to drift away. My favorite architectural detail is the lovely absence of stained glass windows. Because the windows are clear, vast shafts of pure light pour into the space and draw one's mind to a more heavenly beauty flowing down from the sky above. The church is shaped in the form of a cross, and at the center is Bernini's, a large bronze structure with twisted columns called the baldacchino. The bronze to make the structure was melted down from ornamentation in the ceiling at the entrance to the Pantheon, perhaps simply recycling or maybe church-endorsed pillaging of the pagans. At the front of the church, you'll see a very elaborate chair. This chair helps you understand the difference between a church and a cathedral. The Catholics have a bishop appointed over each city. The church where this bishop has his chair from which he rules is called the city's cathedral. So in each city there are many churches, but only one cathedral. The Greek word for chair is cathedra. Catholics also believe that because the Pope is the head of the church, if he makes any statements ex cathedra, that is from his chair, these statements are of equal authority with the Bible. This was a significant dividing point with Protestants, as Luther held that no church councils or papal statements were of equal authority with the Bible. Given the size of the Roman Catholic claims to authority, you can see why they bothered to build such a large church. The size of the church does lend some emotional appeal to the claims despite the absence of biblical evidence to support it. As you look up at the splendid art throughout the basilica, do not forget to look at the art you are always welcome to touch, the floor you walk on. The beautiful collection of marble colors are arranged in an astounding variety of geometric shapes. This also is a nice moment to remember the long-time connection between simple geometric shapes and beauty often found in traditional art. Throughout the church are many statues of the various popes and saints of the Catholic Church history. This also brings up a typical point of difference between Catholics and Protestants. Typically, Catholics continued the ancient Roman love of statuary. However, Protestants saw these as prohibited by the laws in the Bible against idols, and also as a distraction in the worship of the unseen God. Curiously, Muslims also hold that statuary is forbidden in worship. On the other hand, the Eastern Orthodox believe statuary is forbidden, but that images are acceptable so long as they are painted and not sculpted. The most famous of the statues in St. Peter's is Michelangelo's Pietà. It depicts Mary grieving over the body of her dead son. The highly polished finish on the statue is worthy of particular note. Some of the marble folds are so thin that if you put your hand behind them, you can actually see it. For better or worse, the Roman Catholic Church has been able to use this amazing structure as a backdrop on which to perform their ceremonies and draw the respect of millions. Adjoining St. Peter's Basilica are the Vatican Museums. As St. Peter's is a monumental work of architecture, the museums are a testimony to the hundreds of years that the Roman Catholic Church has been attempting to influence Western culture and preserve its memory. As you go through the museum, I would first exhort you to remember to look down. The floors themselves are very accessible and are often covered with some of the most beautiful mosaics you can find. Mosaics are made of small stones of various colors artfully arranged to create designs and patterns of great beauty. Because they are stones rather than painted, They can take the years of wear that arises from so many feet passing over them. While you're looking down, do not also forget to look up, as the ceilings themselves are completely covered in intricate designs as well. One of the most beautiful ceilings is in the Gallery of Maps. The Gallery of Maps is a good place to reflect on one of the most controversial aspects of the Roman Catholic Church in Western history. In the Divine Comedy, the poet Dante tells the story of the supposed donation of Constantine. The story goes that when the Emperor Constantine died, he quite generously left the entire Roman Empire to the Roman Catholic Church to possess in its entirety perpetually.
One might think that this gift was an incredible blessing. However, it set up a lamentable contest for power between the Pope and the princes of Europe during the Middle Ages. The assumption that the Church should possess earthly power as well as spiritual set up a contest between the Pope and the princes. The Pope tried to control the policies of the princes and even developed a papal empire with armies to defend it.
These military popes were able to accumulate more and more lands until the Italians tired of their influence and gradually took back the land until finally in 1860 the Italian patriot Vittorio Emanuele II drove the Pope out of the papal lands and reduced the Pope to just 1 square mile of territory, which today is what we call Vatican City. Emanuele was excommunicated from the Church for his successful military campaign, but his actions effectively ended the Roman Catholic Church's design on establishing its own empire. The Italians themselves have looked more favorably on him and memorialized his influence with a large monument to him near the Forum. However, for a long time, many Roman Catholics thought the Pope's work to establish an empire was in fact the coming of the kingdom of God on earth. In his Leviathan, Hobbes disapprovingly likened the political aspirations of the Roman Catholic Church to the shadow of the Roman Empire. In this view, the aspirations of the Church were simply another attempt to rebuild the empire of ancient Rome.
So, as you look at these maps laid out like the maps in a war room, ask yourself, what should be the relationship between the temporal power of the state and the spiritual power of the Church? Is the First Amendment to the American Constitution that forbids the federal government from establishing or supporting any state church actually denying a beneficial connection between state and church? Or has this separation actually been a remarkable blessing both to the church and to the state?
In most countries, state churches still exist. Germany, England, Russia, Greece all have state-recognized churches. But does this further the kingdom of God, or does it hinder it? The Vatican museums contain many of the most famous art pieces in the world. One of particular interest to great book students is Raphael's School of Athens. Raphael collected many of the greatest Greek philosophers and depicted each one in a fashion that reflects their own particular philosophy. Most telling are the hands of Plato and Aristotle at the very center, whose gestures reflect the respective emphases in these men's philosophies. Plato looked to the world of the forms above, and Aristotle sought to understand the world by finding the distinguishing characteristics in individual things themselves. Plato points up, showing he found meaning by connecting things to the world of the heavens, and Aristotle points down as he found meaning by examining the individual characteristics of things themselves. Plato, the philosopher, looking at the heavens, and Aristotle, the scientist, looking below at the earth. Also note the ceiling above the philosophers, as you'll recognize the ceiling from St. Peter's Basilica, which was under construction when Raphael painted this scene. Like the Egyptian obelisk, the pine cone also shows the connection between Roman Catholic and pagan history. During Roman times, this bronze statue stood next to the Temple of Isis, near the Pantheon. However, during the Middle Ages, it was moved to the Vatican. In the round room, you will see Nero's basin, made from one extremely large piece of porphyry from Egypt.
Nero was known for his particularly lavish lifestyle. He built a luxuriant golden house for himself right in the center of Rome. However, subsequent emperors pulled it down, finding his ego offensive. They built for the people a place for their pleasure, the Colosseum.
This basin gives you a little idea of just how luxuriant the lives of the emperors could go. Also notice that the round room is very similar in shape to the Pantheon. The museum also contains many sarcophagi. The word simply means flesh eater in Greek, as once you put a body in one, after a few years you come back and find only bones. Among the many fine examples of Greek statuary is the Apollo Belvedere. Found in the 15th century, this statue is a very good example of the Greek attempt to portray the human form in perfection rather than showing the often less than pleasing details of real people. These statues are called ideal and often appear rather repetitious, as they can all look the same, perfect. The statue of Laocoon and his sons recounts the story told in the Aeneid of this priest's death as he attempted to warn the Trojans of their destruction before the Greek horse. As Laocoon came to the Trojans, warning them not to take this horse into the city, up from the sea came serpents who wound themselves about him and his poor sons and pulled them into the depths. The Romans loved statuary, and that love carries through to the Roman Catholic Church. Take time to consider the skill of those who so carefully crafted these many images. At the end of your tour of the Vatican museums, you'll be ushered into the Sistine Chapel, where the often vexed church authorities continually try to keep the tourist mobs from defiling one of the church's most sacred chapels with their loud mumbling and flash photography. The ceiling of the chapel, as well as the large wall behind the altar, are painted by Michelangelo. The ceiling itself took 5.5 years. It tells the stories of creation, the expulsion from Eden, and Noah's flood. Particularly interesting is the shape of a brain that God's host has as he gives the touch of life and divine reason to Adam. This ceiling also shows the typical tendency of the church to draw from both pagan and Christian sources. The prophets shown alternate between pagan and biblical. Next to the Delphic oracle, you have the prophet Isaiah, then the pagan Cumaean Sibyl, and then the prophet Daniel. At the end of the room is an equally immense painting behind the altar. Here you see Christ at the end times judging the righteous and the damned. On his right they ascend to heaven, and on his left they are thrust down to judgment in hell. There's an interesting connection between Christ's torso and that of the Belvedere torso that the artist Michelangelo admired so much.
Rome draws from the beauty of the Christian world as well as the pagan. And though learning from the pagans is something I've encouraged for many years as a great books teacher, there's a cautionary tale that must be told. Desiring to hold on to the wonders of the pagan world, Rome has confused pagan truth and Christian. And most critically, it has not been able to clearly distinguish between salvation as presented by Christ and that presented by Plato.
Plato's scheme is clearly presented at the end of his dialogue, the Gorgias. He holds that man's wicked nature leaves scars upon his soul, which put man in a state of condemnation before the gods. Yet, by doing good deeds and working for moral perfection, man is able to cover over those scars. But if by the end of life he has not sufficiently removed those sins from his soul so he pleases the gods, in the afterlife he must go through further discipline and punishments before being good enough to be received into heaven. The Roman Catholic Church Christianized Plato's works-based salvation by adding that it is Christ who comes to our aid in this noble quest for personal betterment by giving us the presence of His Holy Spirit so that we can do enough good to make ourselves worthy of God. We see a fine example of this Christianized Platonism in the Purgatory section of Dante's Divine Comedy. In contrast, the biblical understanding of Christ's work begins in Genesis, with God's promise to Adam and Eve that they will die when they partake of the fruit of the tree. Yet after they do in fact eat of the fruit, God in His grace does not kill them. Rather, He allows them to live, and as they are expelled from the garden, the consequences of sin must still be paid. Someone must die in their place. This is evident as when they leave the garden, they are clothed in the skins of animals, animals who died in their place. This event shows the biblical form of salvation, which is the fact that another must take the penalty of death on man's behalf. This is called substitutionary atonement. The penalty of sin is paid by someone else's death. Throughout the Old Testament, animals stood in for man to pay the death penalty of sin until the real substitute would come, Christ himself. Thus, in the Scriptures, we see that it is in fact Jesus' death that saves, and not Plato and his vision of moral perfection. Though Christ calls us to moral reform, it is his death on the cross that we see as the true means to which we look for our atonement, and not our moral reformation and good works. In our Great Books readings, the best articulation we have of substitutionary atonement is found in Bach's St. Matthew Passion and Luther's commentary on Galatians. Yes, the pagan world is full of much that we should love and learn from. Indeed, from the vision of morality that Plato and pagans espoused, we can learn much about human nature, the beauty of nobility, the necessity of magnanimity, the importance of human dignity, and good principles of government. However, let us not forget that the gospel has made foolishness of the wisdom of this world, and we must never be led astray by vain philosophy, but rest entirely upon the atoning work of Christ on the cross. Built between 118 and 125 AD by the Emperor Hadrian, the Pantheon is not only a masterpiece of geometric architecture, but also shows the engineering genius of the Romans. As you approach this lovely building, first take time to observe the columns that support the roof over the porch. They are 34 feet high and monolithic. Monolithic simply means that they are made of one piece of stone. These are some of the largest monolithic columns I have ever seen. Usually, large columns are made of drums that are then stacked one on top of another until the necessary height is reached. To create a monolithic column, the entire column must be shaped from one piece of stone, an impressive engineering feat in itself. Here you can also increase your affection for the Romans by seeing they also made mistakes. If you're like me, you probably also find people who never make mistakes intolerable. The columns actually arrived a few feet too short, so the roof atop the column needed to be lowered. If you look just above the existing roof line, you will see a line of blocks coming out that were originally designed to receive the roof structure. So much for perfection. Once you proceed in, look up and revel in the wonderful glimpse of sky you see through the oculus, and the wonderful light that streams down from it. The geometry in this structure defines not only the beauty of the shapes in the floor, but as you walk around, you feel the completely ordered space, as the entire building was made to be able to fit a perfect sphere inside. The interior decoration is the accumulation of many years of pagan and Christian influence. Raphael was buried here, as well as the Italian liberator Vittorio Emanuele. Emanuele attempted to found an Italian monarchy, and you can go over to the book next to the royal guard and sign your respects to his lineage. However, despite the fact that Vittorio liberated Italy from the Pope, the royal house of Italy seems to have permanently fallen out of favor with the Italian people. So your name's place in this book will probably never gain you any significant political advantages from the royal family. The engineering genius in this structure is found in the construction of the roof itself. Because of its spherical shape, much of the center of the roof is nearly horizontal, and thus quite difficult to support structurally. However, notice the square insets into the roof. These actually help lighten the roof so that it is not so heavy. The roof is also made out of concrete, and as they progressed towards the top of the roof, the Romans added pumice to the concrete mixture to make it lighter and thus producing a smaller load. Finally, the 30-foot opening at the top is a wonderful means of letting light into the space. However, it also makes the roof lighter so that it can bear its own load more easily. Looking at the Pantheon, we have a wonderful example of the unity between artistic beauty and geometric logic on a very large scale. However, even though not so large, there are many places through history and culture that we see a similar connection between what is beautiful and what is geometric. Whether it be Islamic art, Greek geometric period pottery, Romanesque architecture, Ukrainian decorated eggs, or even just traditional quilting. In many contexts, we see that what is artistically inspired and what is geometrically logical oftentimes come very closely together. This should help us to reflect that our common association that there is some sort of antagonism between what is artistic and what is logical, or between what is beautiful and what is organized. This distinction that we often make is one that we should really realize is somewhat superficial and should be disregarded. Mondays provide a little challenge in Italy as most of the museums are closed. So this day I provide you a free day and suggest 3 very convenient possibilities that are all quite near our next destination, Florence. On your free day I recommend either Pisa, Siena, or Venice. The city of Pisa is not particularly interesting, however the famous Leaning Tower is quite worth your time. It recently was cleaned and its leaning tendencies tamed so that it will not eventually tumble over. It is also good to notice that here you have a set of 3 buildings, a cathedral, a tower, and a baptistry. You'll notice this same set in Florence as well as other Italian cities. Siena is the easiest destination as it is just a short ride from Florence on the bus. Its cathedral and large open square are the main attractions here. You'll notice the cathedral is ornamented with alternating black and white stones. Not surprisingly, these are the colors of Siena's coat of arms. During the Renaissance, there was a fierce competition between Siena and Florence for power in the region, and though Siena was originally stronger, Florence gradually won out. On the floor of the cathedral in Siena, you'll see a mosaic of Hermes Trismegistus. Though his writings actually only date back to the 3rd century AD, many writers during the Renaissance thought that he was a contemporary of Moses and went to his writings as a source of much supposed ancient wisdom. Dante himself actually references Hermes as an ancient authority. The cathedral also houses a fine collection of medieval choral books. Rather than printing each member of the choir with music of his own as we do today, these very large books were simply placed on a high stand where everyone could read off the same book at the same time. The illuminations in these books show the care for detail and beauty of the time. While in Siena, take time to wander about the lovely shopping town, and perhaps you too might name your minivan or first child after her. Venice is a bit farther to go. However, the high-speed train will get you there rather quickly, and you'll be well rewarded with an opportunity to see a completely different way of life. The story of Venice is a long and interesting one. The founding of Venice actually goes back to Romans fleeing the barbarians after the fall of Rome. The Romans sought refuge from the barbarians in the marshes and lagoons of this area. The barbarians were not interested in the land as it did not appear to be habitable. However, the Romans came up with a very ingenious way of establishing buildings in this muddy area. What they did is they actually took very large trees and pounded them down into the mud until they were entirely covered over by the mud. Well, then they would take large stones and place them down into the mud on top of those pylons. The curious thing about this technique is that because this wood would then become entirely covered with mud, it was kept free from any oxygen, and thus the wood did not decay. And so these ancient pylons that the buildings are built on oftentimes go back to the Romans themselves. Now, oftentimes we think of the Roman Empire falling in 476. However, you have to remember this is only part of the story. The Eastern Empire in Constantinople went on until 1453 when it fell before the Ottoman Turks. And yet Venice too continued on. Venice grew in strength throughout the Middle Ages. It became a mighty trading empire, and at its height, Venice was building a ship a day in the narrow strip of water called the Arsenale near St. Mark's Square. In 1204, Venice attacked and significantly weakened the city of Constantinople. After this attack, they brought back the horses of St. Mark's. They were originally Roman in the 3rd century, were taken to Constantinople, and then finally ended up here at St. Mark's. Venice continued as a strong republic until finally it was conquered by Napoleon himself in 1797. So if you want to think of the last vestiges of the Roman Empire falling in 1797 before Napoleon, I don't think you'd be far from the mark. A tour of the Doge's palace is quite interesting. and it was built in various stages between 800 and 1500. I was particularly impressed with the longevity of the Venetian Republic, and though its doges had a reputation for being ruthless in their dealings, Venice had a long history of relatively stable republican government. Also on St. Mark's is the Campanile. This 323-foot tall bell tower was initially constructed around 900 AD and stood until its collapse in 1902, killing only the caretaker's cat. The structure we have today was rebuilt as an exact copy and completed in 1912. St. Mark's Basilica was built around 1000 and has a fascinating front. The columns that decorate the front are of many different types of marble, as most were captured from various cities around the Mediterranean that Venice conquered as its empire grew. The style of the basilica also shows distinct Eastern influence. Its style is much more like the Greek churches in the East surrounding Constantinople rather than those of Rome. The interior is also very Eastern and covered with many very ornate mosaics. The musical prodigy of Venice was Vivaldi. If you love his highly energetic music, there are plenty of opportunities to hear his compositions played in the various churches around the city. Venice is a different world. Living with water as your streets is quite enchanting. The tourists keep coming, but the locals have been leaving for a long time, and the survival of the city is in doubt, as major expenses must be met to ensure the survival of this gradually sinking city. While spending only 3 days in Rome, I always find I'm quite relieved to reach Florence. Though a small city in its own right, downtown Florence is a perfect scale for having so much available to see and learn from, and yet small enough to get around on foot and feel that you can settle into a city that is human-sized. Like Pisa, at the center of Florence we have a cathedral, campanile or tower, and baptistry. While Florence was in an artistic arms race with the surrounding cities, they knew that a massive cathedral would cement their position as the leading city in the region. The Medici family's banking business and the wool guild trade had been so successful that the Florentine florin had become the international currency of the Renaissance. Given the confidence of the city fathers, they began a structure of such size that they really did not know how to complete the massive dome that was needed to cover the center of the building. After completing the lower section, it was the courageous artist and engineer Brunelleschi who proposed the final design for the dome, or as the Italians like to say, Il Duomo. There is a lovely National Geographic article on the story you can find at the link in the notes below. The facade or front of the cathedral is quite lovely, but it was not completed until the 19th century. Many Florentines consider it to be overly ornate, but the marble is quite pleasing. The interior of the cathedral is surprisingly plain. Despite having exiled him for a period, Florence is the city of Dante, and there's a lovely illustrative painting of him and the themes covered in the Divine Comedy found on the walls here. As always, take time to observe the humble servants below your feet, pointing you always towards the beauty of marble and geometric design. A climb to the top of the Duomo or the Campanile will be well rewarded with many fine views of the surrounding buildings and countryside. Across from the cathedral and Campanile stands the baptistry. Children were not allowed into the cathedral until they were baptized, as they were not considered Christians until receiving baptism. Dante himself received baptism here. The baptistry was built between 1059 and 1128, but stands in remarkably good condition. The exterior is a very good example of Romanesque architecture, but its doors and interior ceiling are what draws the most visitors. The set of doors on the east side was created by Lorenzo Ghiberti, and because of their ornate depictions of biblical events, Michelangelo called them the Gates of Paradise. The south doors were created by Andrea Pisano. While they are not as ornate as those of Ghiberti, they combine the Christian and pagan virtues that Dante uses to divide the various levels of purgatory: fortitude, temperance, justice, and prudence, and then from the Christians, faith, hope, and love, or charity. The interior ceiling provides a wonderful challenge as you will attempt to identify all the biblical stories depicted. Christ presides over all as king. You'll also notice the depiction of Satan is very similar to that given by Dante. Dante describes Satan as sitting at the bottom of hell, devouring the worst of sinners. The image of Satan devouring sinners is also used in the ceiling of the cathedral itself. Florence is full of lovely churches. Another favorite is Santa Croce. Here we find the grave of another of Florence's favorite sons, Niccolò Machiavelli, author of The Prince. Although his political thought is widely criticized for being too pessimistic, he had a profound influence on many Italian princes and political thinkers throughout Western history. Now we need to transition from art to church history and theology. Our next stop is the monastery of San Marco, where the monk Savonarola preached and lived. However, before we understand Savonarola, we need to go back even further to the Council of Florence in 1439. And this council cannot be understood without reference to the Emperor Constantine and the fact that he moved the capital of the Roman Empire to Constantinople in 330 AD. So let's rewind for a little bit. By effectively creating two capitals to the empire, Constantine established two cities that would compete for preeminence among the various churches. The power contest eventually led to the Great Schism of the Orthodox and Roman Catholics in 1054. The Pope of Rome and the Patriarch of Constantinople reciprocally excommunicated one another and lived in mutual antagonism, forcing churches to be divided in allegiance to the East or West. However, after the Great Schism, Rome, who had been the poorer half of the empire, rose in power, and the wealthy East faced one setback after another as the Muslim armies continued to slice off portion after portion of the empire. When the Patriarch of Constantinople was almost completely surrounded, he made an attempt at reconciliation with Rome in order to forge a military alliance with the now mighty West. He hoped that this alliance might save him from the hordes of Ottoman Muslims beating down his empire. The Eastern Emperor and Patriarch came to Florence in 1439, and a council was held to work out a compromise. After heated debate, the two actually agreed to reunify the church, being willing to come over to most of the Roman Catholics' doctrines on the points where they had differed. However, most of the Eastern bishops back home would not accept the agreement, and in 1453, Constantinople finally fell to the Ottomans, and the Greek cathedral of Constantinople, Hagia Sophia, was converted into a mosque. During the time of the Council of Florence, the Greek scholar Platon gave lectures on the philosophy of Plato to the intellectuals of Florence. These lectures inspired Cosimo de' Medici to found a new academy of philosophy in Florence that would contribute substantially to the revival of classical learning during the Renaissance. The Medici family became quite interested in a revival of art and classical learning. They were quite impressed by the beauty of the ancient world, but this brings us back to the monk Savonarola. Despite the Medici's love of classical learning, he became very suspicious that all this pagan culture was moving the Florentines away from Christian righteousness. It was here at San Marco that Savonarola lived and began his preaching ministry. Savonarola was a very popular preacher in Florence, and he began to preach against the growing luxuriance and immorality of the city fathers and merchants of Florence, and particularly the luxuriant Medicis. Gradually, he gained the backing of the people of Florence, and for a period, he even established a theocracy in Florence that attempted to reassert biblical law. Savonarola's popularity was short-lived, however, and the wealthy Medici family was able to regain power and eventually even arrest and execute Savonarola in the Piazza della Signoria. Though Savonarola's political power was at an end, many of the criticisms he had for the Florentines and their love of worldly beauty would be echoed by Martin Luther and the Protestants. Luther read Savonarola with approval and felt his thoughts sparked the later Reformation. Walking the streets of Florence is itself a delight. Much of the city center is reserved for pedestrian traffic, and the many small alleyways and wonderful collection of historic buildings creates a nearly limitless space for your exploration and interest. The Loggia dei Lanzi on the Piazza della Signoria, built in 1376, is quite worth your examination. Many statues are housed here, the most famous being that of Perseus holding the head of Medusa, but also lovers of Homer will find the statue of Menelaus and Patroclus interesting. Look up over the arches for the 4 pagan virtues mentioned by Dante: fortitude, temperance, justice, and prudence. Next, we travel to San Lorenzo. From the exterior, it looks quite humble because the facade was never finished. However, the interior is one of the finest you can find for geometric purity. Brunelleschi, the engineering genius behind the construction of the Duomo, used such simple geometric shapes that it is difficult not to feel as one stands inside that you have not entered into the very eternal realm inhabited by the eternal truths of geometry. It is a church, so you should probably be reading your Bible in this space, yet for this geometry teacher, it is with the fourth book of Euclid that I would feel most comfortable. At the back of San Lorenzo are the Medici chapels. The main chapel is filled with the graves of prominent members of this great banking family, and throughout you'll find the work of many of the Renaissance greats. Michelangelo foremost among them. After a morning of the museums, take some time to explore the Pitti Palace and the outdoors Medici style in the Boboli Gardens. Though Florence is a lovely city, it always refreshes the spirits to be more closely aware of God's creation rather than man's. The winding pathways and lovely gardens give you ample opportunity to see much of the green beauty found on a springtime afternoon in Florence. After touring the Boboli Gardens, walk up the hill to San Miniato al Monte. Here you'll have an opportunity to observe pre-Renaissance architecture. During the Romanesque period, you will notice that geometry is prominent, yet without the softening features of the Renaissance. San Miniato would appear overly austere if it weren't for the delightful play of color from the various types of marble used. Once inside, make sure to look up and see the timbered ceiling. Often the ceiling timbers are covered in churches, but here you can see the engineering necessary to cover such a large span. Also go down into the crypt to see the recycled Roman period columns that the church was built upon. I always find the traditional daily Mass an interesting opportunity to see historic Roman Catholic worship. The Gregorian chant is not particularly toe-tapping, but this banjo-picking Southern Californian is still able to find a point of connection in the music. Be sure to take lots of pictures looking back over the valley towards the Duomo. This is one of your best opportunities to see it at a distance. Though you have most likely already seen the copy of Michelangelo's David in the Piazza della Signoria, where it was originally kept as a symbol of the resolute spirit of the Florentines, if you want to see the original, you need to come to the Galleria dell'Accademia, where it is now kept safe from the smog and vast herds of Vespa scooters that Michelangelo's descendants keep circulating through the streets of Florence. Though you would not usually think a trip to prison is the best way of rounding out your trip to Florence, if you would like to see more of Florence's finest pieces, you'll need to spend some time behind bars. From 1255 until 1859, this formidable building served as the central police station, jail, and place of execution for the Florentines. Today it serves as a museum and repository of some of the world's finest pieces of art, so you might say that its brick walls serve more to keep thieves out than in now. There are pieces here by the big names of the Renaissance, Ghiberti, Donatello, Michelangelo, and others. However, I find the fine collection of wooden marquetry particularly interesting, as well as the many weapons in the armory collection. You can also see some of Luca della Robbia's terracotta pieces here. Built in 1419 by Brunelleschi, Ospedale degli Innocenti is a long colonnade originally built as an orphanage home, but is primarily remembered as one of the first buildings in Italy to be designed in the Renaissance rather than Romanesque style. If you look above the arches, you will see the terracotta tondi by della Robbia. The square in front of the building usually is a nice place to find lunch and wander among the street merchants.
It is often easy to think of classical education as primarily driven by art, history, political theory, theology, and philosophy, and that mathematics and science are unfortunate stepchildren who are best left just outside the back door of our attention and thrown a paltry scrap once our attention has finished feasting upon more interesting subjects. Yet classical education pursued with such a mentality will quickly run into the uncomfortable reality that nearly every great book's author demands that we give consideration to the full scope of life. And until we are willing to open ourselves to consider and investigate this wide field of learning, we will have little chance of making sense of the conversation of ideas that has been rumbling down through the corridors of our culture's history.
What we today call science simply used to be called natural philosophy. There is no separation between literature and science. They were simply different parts of the general pursuit of wisdom through philosophy. Whether it be Dante's continual references to astronomy, Aristotle's examination of animals to understand the nature of the soul, or even Leibniz's continual reference to mathematical metaphors to understand the nature of God's providence, great books' authors draw upon the tremendous wisdom to be found in the natural world around us. And particularly if we consider ourselves classical Christian educators, we should be embarrassed by any apathy we show when examining and learning from the natural world. The Galileo Museum is a wonderful introduction to the history of science and its importance to the development of human thought.
Galileo was a gifted observer of nature, and it was the insights gained with this small telescope contained in the Galileo Museum that allowed him to overthrow many of the views that have been held about the universe since the time of Aristotle. Much to the later embarrassment of the Church, many Christians tenaciously held to the opinions of Aristotle and even attempted to claim that the venerable pagan's views were actually Christian orthodoxy and disagreement with him, heresy for a Christian. It is a good thing to note that love of all things classical can be taken too far.
Through this museum, you'll be treated to a parade of instruments that were used by men to poke and probe Lady Nature in order to force out of her precious secrets. The ancient Greek Heraclitus said that nature hides herself. He was correct. It took thousands of years to understand the principles of nature, and often it was not abstract philosophy, but the practical use of instrumentation that allowed mankind to truly understand nature's structure. In this museum, you will see clearly why Francis Bacon was so skeptical of the meanderings of Socrates' dialectical philosophy, and why he emphasized that we must not attempt to see with our unaided philosophical abstractions, but with the practical aid of scientific instruments. The great story of the history of science is the development of astronomy. Even though some of the ancient Greeks believed that the earth went around the sun, Aristotle held that the earth must be at the center, and his position prevailed throughout the Middle Ages. To see why it was actually the earth moving and not the sun that caused us to see what we do in the heavens actually took a long and laborious process of careful observations and remarkably diligent thought and reasoning. Also, very central to Galileo's contribution to the history of science is the study of motion. This museum also holds a number of very important instruments that allowed Galileo to make the substantial breakthroughs that he did in being able to describe motion accurately. Galileo spent much of his time in Florence and was patronized by the Medici family. It is really remarkable that this city has touched so many of the greatest moments in human history. It can be safely said that no other museum in the world contains as much or as high a quality a collection of Italian Renaissance art as the Uffizi galleries. The name simply means offices, as these buildings were the offices of the Medici family business empire. In these walls you will find many of the pieces of art that you grew up looking at in books of reproductions. Before you go, it would be good to take as much time as you can studying the art of the Italian Renaissance, as the topic is quite huge. Coming back to Rome on Saturday gives us the opportunity to see a little more. Rather than taking the time to see the ruins in Pompeii, by traveling just a few metro stops, we find the lovely ruins at Ostia. Once the port of Rome, this city was abandoned as the harbor silted up and the shoreline actually moved farther out to sea. Here you will have the opportunity to wander the streets of the ancient empire and imagine what it would have been like to live in the days of the Caesars. As we come back through Rome, we will visit Santa Maria Maggiore. This church is particularly known for promoting the veneration of Mary. However, I find the roof itself most fascinating as you have an opportunity to glimpse where a great deal of the gold from the New World ended up. The King of Spain gave a great portion of the gold he received from the New World to the beautification of this church.
Traveling to Italy offers many opportunities for the great book student. Not only can you deepen your understanding of history, but give yourself just that much more context in which you can read the great books and better appreciate the meaning they contain.